My wife and her sister sent Mu Epsilon Alpha voicemail. You're out of the family business. Expect a call from our lawyer. I didn't argue. Just replied understood. Then I quietly sold my 95% share. And 24 hours later, 82 missed calls. My wife and her sister begging me to undo it. You know how some days just feel different from the moment you wake up? Like the air's a little thicker, or your coffee tastes just a shade off. Well, that Tuesday started like every other Tuesday I'd had for the past 8 years. My alarm buzzed at 5:47 a.m., not 5:45, not 6 o'clock, but 5:47 because that gave me exactly enough time to shower, grab my usual black coffee, and make it to the supplier site visit without rushing. I've always been precise about timing. It's served me well in business, and honestly, it's probably the only reason I survived what came next. The drive back from the warehouse district took longer than usual. Some fender bender on I-285 had traffic backed up for miles, giving me plenty of time to think about the quarterly numbers I'd been crunching. Vailgro and Company was hitting targets again, just like we had for the past 5 years straight. Not by accident, mind you. Every late night I'd spent reorganizing shipping routes. Every weekend I'd sacrificed to fix their broken systems. Every time I'd quietly cleaned up someone else's mess. It all added up to those clean, beautiful profit margins that kept everyone happy. When I finally pulled into our driveway in Buckhead, I loosened my tie before I even killed the engine. It's funny how such a small gesture can feel like taking off armor. The house was quiet. Rena was probably still at her yoga class, the one she'd been taking religiously since her sister Thea convinced her it was essential for executive presence. I kicked off my dress shoes at the door, something that used to drive Rena crazy, but that I'd started doing anyway. Small rebellions, you know? I made my way to the kitchen and started the ritual that had become sacred to me over the years, brewing a proper cup of coffee. Not the fancy espresso machine Rena had insisted we needed, but my old French press. Something about the deliberate process, measuring exactly 4 tablespoons of grounds, heating the water to precisely 200 degrees, timing the 4-minute steep, it centered me. Gave me a few minutes to transition from the chaos of managing other people's problems to whatever waited for me at home. That's when I noticed it. The little red light on our landline answering machine was blinking. One message. Most people texted or called ourselves these days, so a voicemail on the house phone was unusual. I almost ignored it. Probably another robocall about extending our car warranty or some political campaign asking for donations. But something made me walk over and hit play. The machine crackled to life, and I heard Rena's voice. But not the warm, familiar voice that used to greet me when I came home from long days. This was different. Professional. Cold. The voice she used in board meetings when she was about to deliver bad news to vendors. You're out of the family business, Silas. Expect a call from our lawyer. I stood there, coffee mug halfway to my lips, trying to process what I'd just heard. Out of the family business? The business I'd essentially rebuilt from the ground up? The business that wouldn't exist in its current form without the systems I'd implemented, the relationships I'd cultivated, the fires I'd put out quietly and efficiently for nearly a decade? But before I could fully wrap my head around Rena's message, another voice chimed in. Thea. Of course it was Thea. Her voice was smoother than her sister's, but there was something underneath it, satisfaction maybe? Like she'd been waiting years to deliver this particular message. This is final. We wish you the best. And then silence. The machine clicked off, and I was left standing in my kitchen, holding my coffee, staring at a blinking red light that had just delivered the equivalent of a corporate pink slip via voicemail. No explanation. No discussion. No acknowledgement of everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given to make their family's legacy company into something worth bragging about at country club dinners. Just, you're out. And we wish you the best. Like I was some seasonal employee they were letting go after the holiday rush. I took a sip of my coffee. It was perfect, strong, hot, exactly the way I liked it. For some reason, that small consistency felt important in a moment when everything else had just shifted beneath my feet. I didn't feel the urge to call back immediately. I didn't feel the need to rush over to the office and demand explanations. I didn't even feel particularly angry, which probably should have worried me more than it did. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, clarity. I walked over to my laptop, opened my email, and typed out a response. Not to Rena, She'd clearly decided this conversation was over before it started. I replied to the email thread that included both sisters, the one they'd probably used to coordinate this little ambush. Understood. One word. That's all they deserved after 8 years of my life, after countless 14-hour days, after building something they could be proud of. One word that acknowledged their message without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me scramble or beg or demand explanations they clearly had no intention of providing. After I hit send, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went completely quiet. I turned off my phone, closed my laptop, and sat in my kitchen with my perfect cup of coffee, thinking with the kind of precision that had made me valuable to them in the first place. They wanted me out? Fine. But they were about to learn the difference between dismissing an employee and dismissing the person who actually understood how everything worked. I was about to become very, very precise about showing them exactly what they just lost. Let me take you back to where this whole mess started. Emory University, fall of 2016. I was working on my MBA, grinding through financial modeling classes and supply chain management seminars, when I first laid eyes on Rena Vailgrow. She was impossible to miss, honestly. While the rest of us were hunched over laptops in the library, she was holding court in the student lounge, gesturing wildly as she explained some grand business theory to whoever would listen. Her voice carried across 3 tables, confident and commanding in that way that made professors either love her or hate her, depending on whether they appreciated being challenged in front of 30 other students. Me? I was the guy in the back corner, taking meticulous notes, asking precise questions, and generally flying under the radar. I'd learned early that being the loudest voice in the room didn't always mean you were the smartest one. But Rena, she was both loud and brilliant, and that combination was magnetic in a way I'd never experienced before. She had this energy that made you want to be part of whatever she was building, even if you weren't entirely sure what that was yet. We ended up paired together for a semester-long project on operational efficiency in mid-sized logistics companies. Pure coincidence, or maybe the professor saw something I didn't. Either way, that's when I got my first real look at Vailgrow & Company, her family's business that she talked about with the kind of pride usually reserved for war stories or championship trophies. The company had been around since her grandfather's time, started as a small trucking operation that had grown into what she called a boutique logistics solutions provider. What I saw when I dug into their financials for our project was a different story entirely. Vailgrow & Company wasn't boutique, it was barely surviving. Their cash flow looked like a roller coaster designed by someone with a serious grudge against physics. Profit margins that fluctuated wildly from quarter to quarter. Customer retention rates that would make a telemarketer nervous. And operational systems that seemed to have been designed by throwing darts at a board while blindfolded. But here's the thing about Rena. She didn't see chaos. She saw potential. And when I started pointing out specific areas where they were hemorrhaging money, she didn't get defensive like most people would. She got excited. She saw solutions where I saw problems, and somehow that made me want to find even more solutions. Our project turned into something bigger than either of us had planned. Instead of just analyzing their inefficiencies for a grade, we started actually fixing them. I'd stay up until 3 in the morning building new inventory management systems, and she'd be right there beside me, calling suppliers and renegotiating contracts based on the data I was pulling together. It was the kind of collaboration that doesn't happen often. 2 completely different approaches to problem solving that somehow clicked together like puzzle pieces. When we presented our final project, we weren't just showing theoretical improvements. We were showing actual results. A 23% reduction in late shipments over 2 months. A 31% improvement in profit margins on their 3 biggest accounts. Cost savings that added up to more than some companies' entire annual revenue. Our professor called it the most practical application of business theory he'd seen in 15 years of teaching. That's when Rena's father, Marcus Vailgrow, asked to meet me. Marcus was old school in the best possible way, the kind of guy who still believed a handshake meant something and who could tell you exactly how many miles were on every truck in his fleet. But he was also smart enough to recognize when his company needed help, even if that help came from some graduate student his daughter had dragged home from business school. You see things, he told me over dinner at their house in Vinings. Most people look at spreadsheets and see numbers. You look at spreadsheets and see stories. That's a rare skill. He offered me a position right there at the dinner table. No formal interview process, no HR department to navigate, just a straightforward proposition. Come work for Vale and Company and help them figure out how to grow without losing their souls in the process. Here's where it gets interesting, though. He didn't offer me some entry-level analyst position or a junior management role. He didn't offer me a salary, benefits, or even a proper title. What he offered me was equity, a small percentage of ownership in exchange for fixing the fundamental problems that were keeping them from becoming the company they could be. Work for free for the first year, he said. Show me what you can really do, and we'll talk about making it official. Most people would have walked away. Hell, most people should have walked away. Working for free, with no guarantee of anything beyond Marcus's word. It sounded like the kind of deal that ends with someone getting screwed over by a family business that decides blood is thicker than talent. But I saw something they didn't. I saw a company with incredible bones, good relationships with suppliers, loyal customers who kept coming back despite operational headaches, and a reputation for reliability that had been built over decades. All they needed was someone to organize the chaos, streamline the processes, and turn their potential into consistent profit. So I said yes. I graduated, moved to Atlanta full-time, and started showing up at Vale and Company every morning at 7 sharp, ready to dig into whatever crisis was waiting for me. And there was always a crisis waiting. Shipments that had gone missing, customers threatening to switch providers, inventory that didn't match the computer system, financial reports that made about as much sense as a foreign language. For that first year, I worked without pay, without an official title, without even my own office. I sat at a folding table in the corner of the warehouse and rebuilt their entire operational infrastructure from scratch. I created systems for tracking shipments, developed relationships with new suppliers, implemented quality control processes that actually worked, and slowly but surely turned their chaos into something that resembled a real business. And everyone noticed. Customers stopped complaining. Suppliers started offering better terms. Employees stopped looking like they were constantly putting out fires and started looking like they knew what they were doing. Everyone noticed except Thea. She smiled when Marcus praised my work, nodded approvingly when the quarterly numbers showed consistent improvement, and even complimented me on the new systems I'd implemented. But her smiles never quite reached her eyes, and I started getting the feeling that she saw my success as something that was somehow taking away from the family legacy rather than adding to it. I should have paid more attention to those smiles. The thing about working 14-hour days is that after a while, they stop feeling abnormal. What starts as temporary crisis management becomes your new baseline, and before you know it, you're the guy who's always first in the office and last to leave. That became my life at Vale and Company. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the work demanded it, and I was apparently the only one who could see all the moving pieces that needed constant attention. While Rena and Thea were building their public profiles as the dynamic sister duo revolutionizing logistics, I was in the background making sure their revolution actually functioned. Every morning, I'd arrive to find my desk covered with sticky notes from the night crew, shipments that needed rerouting, customer complaints that required immediate attention, vendor issues that couldn't wait for normal business hours. By the time the sisters rolled in around 9:30 with their matching designer coffee cups and perfectly coordinated outfits, I'd already solved half a dozen problems they'd never even know existed. Not that I minded initially. There's something satisfying about being the person who keeps everything running smoothly, even if nobody notices the effort. When a major client's shipment got delayed due to a dock workers' strike in Savannah, I had alternative routes mapped out and backup carriers on standby before anyone else even knew there was a problem. When our biggest suppliers suddenly jacked up their rates by 30%, I'd already identified 3 competitors who could match their quality at better prices. When the state decided to audit our transportation compliance records, I had every document organized, cross-referenced, and ready for inspection within 6 hours. I became the guy who fixed things before they broke, anticipated problems before they materialized, and somehow made the impossible logistics of running a complex business look effortless. The irony wasn't lost on me. The better I got at my job, the more invisible my contributions became. Success in operations is like being a really good referee in sports. When you're doing everything right, nobody notices you're there. Meanwhile, Rena and Thea were becoming the faces of Valegrow and Company in ways that would have made their grandfather proud, if not entirely comfortable. Industry magazines started featuring them in articles about women breaking barriers in male-dominated industries. They got invited to speak at logistics conferences, business leadership panels, and networking events where successful entrepreneurs shared their secrets with aspiring business owners. Their LinkedIn profiles started collecting those little blue check marks that meant they were officially important enough for verification. And they were good at it. I'll give them that. Rena had this way of explaining complex supply chain concepts that made them sound both sophisticated and accessible. She could talk to a room full of potential clients and make them believe that partnering with Valegrow and Company wasn't just a business decision. It was joining a family legacy that valued both innovation and reliability. Thea was smoother, more polished in her approach. She specialized in the financial presentations, the ones that showed consistent growth and expanding market share, always delivered with the kind of confidence that made investors reach for their checkbooks. They'd come back from these events energized and full of new ideas, ready to implement the latest industry trends they'd learned about from other successful companies. Some of their ideas were actually brilliant, like the customer portal system that allowed clients to track their shipments in real time, which I spent 3 months developing and implementing. Others were less practical, like the plan to rebrand the entire company around sustainable logistics solutions without actually changing any of our environmental practices, which I quietly shelved after calculating what it would cost versus what it would actually accomplish. But here's what started bothering me. The stories they told at these events weren't entirely accurate. Not maliciously inaccurate, but the kind of simplified narrative that makes for better presentations than truth. In their version of Valegrow and Company's success story, they were the visionary leaders who had transformed their grandfather's trucking company into a modern logistics powerhouse through innovative thinking and strategic partnerships. The operational improvements, the system redesigns, the relationship management that actually drove our growth. All of that got condensed into vague references to our team's dedication or collaborative leadership approaches. I noticed it first when Rena came back from a conference in Chicago, excited about how well her presentation had been received. She'd titled it, Building Tomorrow's Logistics Today, and according to her, the audience had been fascinated by how they'd revolutionized traditional supply chain management through technology integration and customer-focused solutions. When I asked to see the slides, I realized that everything she presented as we implemented or our strategy involved were systems and processes I developed, often working alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home. It wasn't that she was deliberately taking credit for my work. It was more like my contributions had become so integrated into the company's success that they'd stopped being visible as separate achievements. I'd become part of the infrastructure, as essential and unnoticed as the electrical wiring in the walls. The board meetings started changing too. What used to be collaborative discussions about strategy and growth became presentations where Rena and Thea would outline their vision for the company's future, and I'd be expected to figure out how to make those visions practical and profitable. When they decided we needed to expand into pharmaceutical logistics, I spent months researching regulations, developing specialized protocols, and building relationships with compliance officers. When they announced we were launching same-day delivery services in 3 major markets, I redesigned our entire routing system and negotiated contracts with local courier networks. But increasingly, those meetings happened without me. I'd find out about major strategic decisions through email summaries or casual mentions in conversations. The quarterly budget reviews that I used to lead became presentations where Thea would explain financial projections based on spreadsheets I created, but adapted in ways that didn't always make sense from an operational standpoint. The most telling moment came during a planning session for what they called Valegrow 2.0, their vision for expanding into new markets and service offerings. I'd prepared detailed analysis on capacity requirements, infrastructure investments, and realistic timelines for growth. But when I tried to present my findings, Thea interrupted to say they'd already committed to aggressive expansion targets in 3 major cities, based on market research that somehow hadn't included any input from the person who actually understood our operational capabilities. That's when I realized I wasn't being forgotten or overlooked. I was being systematically excluded from decisions about the company I'd helped build while being expected to make those decisions work regardless of whether they were grounded in reality. I didn't confront them about it. I didn't demand explanations or insist on being included in strategic planning. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I made notes, kept detailed records, and continued doing the work that kept everything running smoothly. But I also started paying closer attention to things I'd previously taken for granted, like exactly who owned what percentage of the company and what rights came with that ownership. After that voicemail finished playing, something interesting happened to my brain. Most people, when they get blindsided like that, go straight into panic mode, calling everyone they know, demanding explanations, making emotional decisions they'll regret later. Me? I went to my home office and pulled out a 3-ring binder I'd been maintaining for years without really thinking about why. The binder was labeled VGC Financial Records in my neat handwriting, and it contained something most employees don't keep: copies of every single financial transaction I'd ever made on behalf of Vailgrow & Company. Bank transfers when cash flow got tight and payroll needed to be met. Personal loan guarantees I'd signed when we needed credit to expand our fleet. Equipment purchases I'd made using my own credit when the company's was maxed out. Even receipts for business dinners and client entertainment that I'd paid for out of pocket because it was easier than waiting for reimbursement approvals. See, when you're the guy who actually runs the day-to-day operations, you end up covering a lot of gaps that show up in financial statements as miscellaneous expenses or get buried in quarterly summaries. But I kept records of everything, not because I was planning some future legal battle, but because I'm the kind of person who keeps records. It's just how my mind works. As I flipped through page after page of bank statements, canceled checks, and wire transfer confirmations, I started doing math in my head. When we'd needed $180,000 to cover a supplier payment that couldn't wait for a client's delayed payment, I provided it. When our insurance company demanded a $75,000 deposit to maintain our fleet coverage after that accident in Birmingham, I covered it. When we had the opportunity to buy out a smaller competitor but needed to move fast before they accepted another offer, I'd personally guaranteed the $220,000 acquisition loan. All told, over the past 8 years, I'd invested just over $800,000 of my own money into keeping Vailgrow & Company operational during rough patches. Not loans to the company, actual investments, documented as capital contributions that increased my ownership stake. Every dollar had been properly recorded, approved by Marcus before his retirement, and filed with our corporate attorney. The really beautiful part? None of it had ever been paid back because it had all been converted to equity. Every time I'd saved the company's ass financially, my ownership percentage had increased. What started as a small stake Marcus had given me for my first year of free labor had grown substantially every time I'd written a check to keep the lights on. I pulled out my calculator, the old-fashioned kind that prints receipts, because I'm paranoid about having hard copies of important calculations, and started adding up my total equity position. The numbers were even better than I'd remembered. 95%. I own 95% of Vailgrow & Company, with Rena and Thea splitting the remaining 5% between them. Marcus had insisted on the arrangement when he'd stepped down 3 years ago. "You built this company into what it is today," he'd told me during the ownership transfer meeting. "Rena and Thea are smart women, but they're better at selling the dream than making it reality. You've earned this." The sisters had been in the room when he'd said it. They'd smiled and nodded and congratulated me like it was exactly what they'd wanted. At the time, I'd thought their gracious acceptance meant we were all on the same page about how the company should move forward. Apparently, I'd been wrong about that. I closed the binder and picked up my phone. There was exactly one person I trusted to handle what came next: Mara Baines. We'd met during my MBA program, where she'd been working on her JD/MBA joint degree while I'd been focused purely on business. After graduation, she'd gone into corporate law, specializing in business acquisitions and partnership disputes. More importantly, she was one of the few people I knew who understood the difference between being technically right and being strategically smart. "Silas." Mara answered on the second ring. "This is unexpected. You usually only call me when someone's trying to screw you over." "Funny you should mention that," I said. "Got a minute to listen to something?" I played her the voicemail. The line went quiet for about 30 seconds after it finished. "They left you a voicemail?" she finally asked. "To fire you from a company you own?" 95% of, I confirmed. Jesus Christ, Silas. Please tell me you have documentation for that ownership stake. 3 ring binders worth. And they don't know how much you actually own. I don't think they've looked at the corporate filings since Marcus stepped down. They've been too busy playing CEO for the cameras. Mara was quiet again, but I could practically hear the wheels turning in her lawyer brain. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into what I called her predator mode, calm, precise, and absolutely ruthless. Here's what's going to happen, she said. We're going to treat this exactly like they asked us to. They want you out of the family business? Fine. We'll arrange for you to exit completely. But we're going to do it properly, with full fair market valuation of your equity stake. Meaning someone's going to have to buy you out at 95% of whatever Valegrow and Company is worth. And based on the financial reports you've been sending me over the years, that's going to be a very large number. And if they can't afford it, then they'll have to find someone who can. I've got 3 private equity firms on speed dial who specialize in logistics acquisitions. Want me to make some calls? I thought about it for exactly as long as it took me to remember the smugness in Thea's voice when she delivered her, "This is final" line. Make the calls, I said. They won't see this coming, Mara warned me. Good, I replied. They wanted me to be quiet and precise. I'm about to show them exactly what that looks like. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 8 years of working at Valegrow and Company. I stayed home. Didn't call in sick. Didn't send any emails explaining my absence. Didn't try to hand off my responsibilities to anyone else. I just didn't show up. By 10 a.m., my phone was ringing constantly. By noon, I had 17 unread text messages. By 2 p.m., someone had apparently driven by my house to see if my car was in the driveway. I ignored all of it. Instead, I spent the day organizing my documentation, scanning everything into digital files, and preparing for what Mara had warned me would be the most expensive lesson in corporate ownership these women have ever received. They wanted me out. They were about to get exactly what they'd asked for. Mara wasn't kidding when she said she had connections. Within 6 hours of our phone call, my inbox had 3 preliminary acquisition proposals from firms I'd only heard about in Wall Street Journal articles. But one name stood out immediately, Stratmore Capital. These weren't the kind of guys who bought struggling companies hoping to turn them around. They specialized in acquiring profitable businesses with solid fundamentals and then squeezing every possible dollar out of operational efficiency improvements. In other words, they were exactly like me, but with unlimited resources and zero emotional attachment to preserving anyone's feelings. The Stratmore team moved faster than I'd ever seen a corporation operate. By Thursday morning, they'd already pulled Valegrow and Company's credit reports, reviewed our client contracts, and somehow gotten their hands on 3 years' worth of financial statements that I was pretty sure Rena and Thea didn't even know existed. Their preliminary offer arrived via encrypted email at 2:47 p.m., and the number made me set down my coffee cup to make sure I was reading it correctly. They were offering $12.3 million for my 95% stake. Cash, with a 30-day closing timeline. For context, that was roughly 4 times what I'd estimated the company was worth based on our annual revenue. But Stratmore's analysts had apparently seen something in our operational efficiency metrics and client retention rates that suggested the business was significantly undervalued. According to their assessment, Valegrow and Company had the infrastructure and relationships to handle 3 times our current volume without major capital investments. We'd just never pursued aggressive growth because we'd been too busy maintaining the status quo. The irony was delicious. All those years I'd spent building systems that could scale, developing redundant processes, and maintaining relationships with backup suppliers just in case. I'd accidentally created exactly the kind of operation that private equity firms dream about acquiring. Mara called me that evening with an update that made the whole situation even more surreal. They want to move fast, she said. Like, obscenely fast. Stratmore's already got their financing lined up, and they're willing to waive the standard inspection period if we can guarantee that all your documentation is accurate. It is, I said. I know it is. You're the most anal retentive record keeper I've ever met. But here's the thing. They're so confident in your operational setup that they're offering a premium to close quickly. They want to lock this down before anyone else realizes what they're buying. Anyone else meaning Rena and Thea? Specifically meaning Rena and Thea. Once this sale goes through, they'll own 5% of a company that's no longer family-controlled. And according to the shareholder agreement you showed me, minority stakeholders have very limited rights when it comes to operational decisions. I thought about that for a moment. So they'd essentially be employees of whoever buys my stake. Employees, consultants, or completely out, depending on what the new owners decide. But definitely not decision makers. The beauty of the situation was becoming clearer by the hour. By trying to push me out through a voicemail, they'd accidentally triggered a process that would push them out entirely. And because I owned such an overwhelming majority of the company, I could make the sale without their approval, input, or even advance notice. How long until they find out? I asked. Legally, we have to notify all shareholders of any proposed sale. But since this is happening so fast, and since you're technically selling to a third party rather than dissolving the company, we can wait until the contracts are signed to send notification. Meaning they'll find out about the sale approximately 5 minutes before it becomes final and irreversible. I told Mara to move forward with Stratmore's offer. The due diligence process was like watching a team of forensic accountants perform surgery. Stratmore's people went through 8 years' worth of financial records with the kind of thoroughness that would have impressed the IRS. They verified every client contract, confirmed every supplier relationship, and analyzed every operational metric I'd been tracking. They even interviewed some of our major clients, discreetly, as part of what they called market research for potential partnership opportunities. What they found exceeded their expectations. Not only were our financials exactly as I'd represented them, but our client satisfaction scores were higher than industry averages. Our operational costs were lower than comparable companies, and our growth potential was substantially greater than our current performance suggested. By the following Tuesday, they'd completed their analysis and were ready to close. I spent that morning in Mara's office, signing documents that would transfer ownership of everything I'd built over the past 8 years. Stock transfer agreements, employment termination papers, non-compete waivers, and about 30 other legal documents that essentially severed my connection to Vale Grow and Company forever. The wire transfer hit my account at 2:23 p.m. $12.3 million, minus Mara's fees and various transaction costs, but still more money than I'd ever imagined having at once. At 2:24 p.m., Mara sent the required shareholder notification emails to Rena and Thea, informing them that Vale Grow and Company had been acquired by Stratmore Capital, effective immediately. My phone started ringing at 2:26 p.m. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat in Mara's office and watched the call counter on my phone climb steadily higher. 1 call, then 5, then 10. By 3 p.m., I had 23 missed calls and my voicemail was full. You might want to turn that off, Mara suggested, nodding toward my phone. Not yet, I said. I want to see how high the number gets. By 4 p.m., I was at 47 missed calls. Text messages were flooding in faster than I could count them, ranging from confused, "What's happening?" to angry, "Call me immediately," to panicked, "We need to fix this." At 5 p.m., I finally turned off my phone. That night, I slept better than I had in months. For the first time in 8 years, I went to bed knowing that whatever problems existed at the company I'd built, they were no longer my problems to solve. Someone else could deal with the late shipments, the vendor complaints, the staffing issues, and all the other small daily crises that had consumed my life for nearly a decade. I was officially out of the family business, exactly as they'd requested. The next morning, I turned my phone back on to find 82 missed calls and a voicemail box so full that new messages were being rejected. But I wasn't interested in hearing explanations or apologies or desperate attempts to undo what they'd set in motion. I was interested in seeing what happened when a smoothly operating company suddenly lost the person who'd made it operate smoothly. I didn't have to wait long to find out. Stratmore Capital didn't waste time with pleasantries or transition periods. The morning after the acquisition closed, they had a team of analysts on site at Vale Grow and Company conducting what they politely called an operational assessment, but what anyone with half a brain could see was a full-scale audit of everything that had been happening while the family thought they were running the show. I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, obviously, but I had friends throughout the company who kept me updated on the unfolding chaos. According to Sarah from accounting, the Stratmore team showed up at 7 a.m. sharp. 3 guys in identical Navy suits carrying laptops and the kind of professional politeness that makes everyone nervous. They'd introduce themselves to whoever was unlucky enough to be there early, explained that they were the new ownership group, and immediately started asking for access to financial records, vendor contracts, and operational reports. The first thing they did was pause all discretionary spending pending review. Every purchase order over $500 now required approval from their interim management team. Every vendor contract was flagged for renegotiation. Every recurring expense was questioned and categorized as either essential for operations or subject to elimination. This might sound like standard corporate cost-cutting, but here's what made it particularly brutal. Rena and Thea had been spending money like they were running a lifestyle business rather than a logistics company. The monthly flower arrangements for the lobby? Gone. The catered lunch meetings that happened twice a week? Canceled. The company membership at the country club that nobody except Thea ever used? Terminated immediately. But the real shock came when Stratmore started digging into what they called executive compensation and benefits. See, while I'd been working 14-hour days and reinvesting my own money to keep the company operational, the sisters had been paying themselves salaries that were roughly double what comparable executives at similar companies were making, plus bonuses, plus expense accounts that included everything from business development dinners at five-star restaurants to industry research trips that looked suspiciously like vacations. Rena's quarterly trips to logistics conferences in Milan and Barcelona, flagged as excessive and unjustified. Thea's habit of billing first-class flights and luxury hotel stays to the company for what she called relationship building with potential clients. Immediately suspended pending documentation of actual business outcomes. The BMW lease payments that had somehow gotten categorized as company vehicles despite being parked in their personal driveways, transferred back to personal responsibility effective immediately. Within a week, Stratmore had identified over $200,000 in annual expenses that couldn't be justified as necessary business costs. But that was just the beginning of their problems. The operational audit revealed something even more damaging. Without me there to coordinate everything, the company's day-to-day functions were falling apart faster than anyone had anticipated. Shipments that should have been routed through our most cost-effective carriers were being handled by expensive backup providers because nobody knew which suppliers offered the best rates for different types of cargo. Customer service inquiries that I used to resolve within hours were now taking days to address because the person who'd handled those relationships, me, was no longer available to explain the specific requirements of each client. 3 of our biggest accounts called within the first week to complain about delayed deliveries and poor communication. 2 of them threatened to switch to competitors if service levels didn't improve immediately. 1 actually did switch, taking their $180,000 annual contract to a firm that could guarantee the reliability they'd grown accustomed to when I was managing their account personally. But the real catastrophe came when someone from the marketing department, I'm pretty sure it was Jenny, who'd always been suspicious about some of Thea's vendor relationships, sent an anonymous email to Stratmore's management team. The email contained copies of invoices from something called Meridian Consulting Solutions that had been billing Vailgrow and Company for $8,000 per month in Strat. Here's the thing about Meridian Consulting Solutions. It was a shell company owned by Thea's college roommate who had no experience in logistics, no relevant qualifications, and no apparent function except to cash checks for work that was never clearly defined. The email included copies of the contracts, which were vague enough to mean basically nothing, and bank records showing that the payments had been approved personally by Thea without any oversight or documentation of actual services provided. When Stratmore's investigators started pulling that thread, they found 2 other similar arrangements. A technology consulting contract with a firm that turned out to be owned by Rena's former boyfriend, who had been paid $120,000 over 18 months to evaluate software solutions, despite the fact that all our actual technology upgrades had been implemented by me using systems I'd researched and selected personally. And a market research contract with a company that existed only on paper but had somehow managed to bill $45,000 for competitive analysis reports that nobody could locate in any company files. The Stratmore team was thorough, professional, and absolutely ruthless in their documentation of what they found. Every questionable expense was cataloged, Every suspicious contract was flagged, and every deviation from standard business practices was noted in reports that read like a prosecutor's case file. Within 2 weeks of the acquisition, department heads started resigning. The operations manager, who'd been struggling to fill the gap I'd left, accepted a position with another company rather than try to explain to the new owners why productivity had dropped 30% since the transition. The customer service supervisor, who'd been fielding increasingly angry calls from clients experiencing delayed shipments, decided that updating her resume was a better use of time than learning new systems under hostile management. Most telling of all, Marcus Vailgrow, who'd largely stayed out of company business since his retirement, called Stratmore CEO personally to apologize for what he called the current leadership's departure from the business practices that built this company's reputation. According to the rumor mill, he'd offered to come out of retirement temporarily to help stabilize operations, an offer that Stratmore politely declined while noting that they appreciated his concern for the company's welfare. The foundation I'd built over 8 years was crumbling, not because Stratmore was destroying it, but because the people who'd taken credit for building it had never actually understood how it worked. They'd been the face of a successful operation without being the brain behind it, and now that the brain was gone, all their public relations skills and media-friendly personalities couldn't keep the machinery running. I wasn't orchestrating any of this chaos. I wasn't sabotaging anything or encouraging anyone to quit or providing information to investigators. I was just gone, and apparently, that was enough. By the 3rd week after the sale, my phone had finally stopped ringing constantly. The missed call counter had stopped climbing somewhere around 137, and the desperate text messages had dwindled from a flood to a trickle. I'd started to think that maybe Rena and Thea had finally accepted the reality of their situation and moved on to whatever comes after watching your family legacy get dismantled by corporate efficiency experts. I was wrong. The call came at 8:23 p.m. on a Thursday while I was sitting on my back deck, enjoying a bourbon and watching the sunset. I'd gotten into the habit of turning my phone off during the day and checking messages only in the evening, mostly because hearing constant notifications had started to feel like psychological warfare. When I powered it back on that night, it immediately started buzzing with an incoming call. Rena's name appeared on the screen. Call number 83, according to my count. I almost let it go to voicemail like all the others. But something about the persistence, the sheer stubborn refusal to accept that I wasn't going to respond, made me curious. After 3 weeks of radio silence from me, what could possibly be so important that she was still trying? I answered on the 5th ring. Hello, Rena. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different than I'd ever heard it. Not the confident, commanding tone she used in business meetings or the warm, familiar voice from our early days together. This was smaller, shakier, like someone who'd been crying and was trying to hold it together long enough to have a conversation. Silas, she said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. Thank you for answering. You're welcome. Another pause. I could hear background noise, traffic, maybe, or wind. She was probably calling from her car, which meant she was driving around trying to work up the courage to make this call. The image was almost funny, if it hadn't been so pathetic. We need to talk, she continued. About what happened. About how we can fix this. Fix what exactly? You know what? The sale. Stratmore. Everything that's been happening since you left. Left. That was an interesting way to describe being fired via voicemail, but I didn't correct her. I'm listening, I said. What followed was a monologue that sounded like she'd been rehearsing it for days. She explained how the transition had been more challenging than anticipated. How Stratmore's management style was incompatible with the company culture we'd built together. How the operational changes were disrupting relationships with long-term clients. How several key employees had already resigned and others were exploring other opportunities. She didn't mention the financial irregularities that Stratmore had discovered. She didn't acknowledge the questionable consulting contracts or the excessive executive compensation or any of the other issues that had been documented in the audit reports. According to her version of events, the only problem was that the new owners didn't understand the personal touch that had made Vailgrow and company successful. The thing is, she said, and her voice started to crack, we didn't realize how much you were handling, how many things you were keeping track of. We thought we understood the business, but it turns out we were only seeing part of it. This was as close to an admission of error as I was likely to get from Rena. Not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, firing the person who actually ran the company hadn't been the smartest strategic move. Silas, you didn't have to go that far. There it was. The accusation I'd been waiting for. Somehow, in her mind, selling my ownership stake to a private equity firm was an act of aggression rather than a logical response to being told I was no longer wanted. Go how far? I asked. You know what I mean. Selling to Stratmore. Destroying everything we built together. You could have just talked to us. We could have worked something out. I took a sip of my bourbon and considered how to respond. The rational part of my brain wanted to explain the sequence of events that had led to this moment. How their voicemail had made it clear that discussion wasn't an option. How they'd systematically excluded me from decision-making while expecting me to implement their decisions. How the sale had been a business transaction, not revenge. But I was tired of being rational about their irrationality. You said I was out. I replied simply. We didn't mean. You said I was out of the family business. I continued. You said it was final. You said you wish me the best. Those were your words, Rena. I just took them at face value. Silence again. When she spoke next, her voice was smaller than before. We made a mistake. We should have talked to you first. We should have explained what we were thinking, why we thought changes needed to be made. We handled it wrong. Yes, you did. But that doesn't mean we can't fix it. Stratmore is willing to sell the company back if we can arrange financing. We could start over, do things differently this time. You could come back as a full partner, equal say in everything. We've learned our lesson. Equal say? After 8 years of building the foundation they'd taken credit for, after investing nearly $1 million of my own money to keep their family legacy afloat, after creating the systems and relationships that had made them look successful, they were offering me equal say. That's generous, I said. We need you, Silas. The company needs you. Without your systems, your relationships, your way of handling everything, it's falling apart. Clients are leaving. Employees are quitting. Stratmore is talking about restructuring operations and eliminating redundancies, which means they're going to fire people and cut services until there's nothing left of what we built. What we built. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she was still talking about it like it had been a collaborative effort. That's when I heard another voice in the background. Thea, saying something I couldn't quite make out, but that sounded urgent and demanding. Hold on, Rena said, and I could hear muffled conversation as she covered the phone. When she came back, her tone had changed again. Less pleading, more demanding. Thea had apparently reminded her of something. Look, Silas, you've made your point. You've shown us what happens when you're not involved. But this has gone far enough. You can't just destroy a family business because your feelings got hurt. And there it was. The real Rena. The one who thought firing someone via voicemail was acceptable, but selling your ownership stake was somehow vindictive. My feelings aren't hurt, I said calmly. Then why won't you help us fix this? I finished my bourbon and set the glass down on the deck railing, considering how to end this conversation in a way that would make my position absolutely clear. Because you could have talked to me, I said finally. Instead, you rehearsed a voicemail. 3 days after that phone call, a courier showed up at my door with an envelope that looked expensive, thick cream paper, law firm letterhead, the kind of formal presentation that's designed to make you take whatever's inside very seriously. I knew what it was before I opened it, but seeing petition for dissolution of marriage, printed in formal legal language, still felt surreal. Rena was divorcing me. According to the documents, she was citing irreconcilable differences, which was probably the most honest thing she'd said about our relationship in months. But as I read through the filing, it became clear that this wasn't just about ending our marriage. This was a calculated attempt to salvage whatever she could from the wreckage of her family's business. The petition claimed that my sale of Vale Grow and Company had caused her severe emotional distress and reputational harm. It alleged that I had acted in bad faith by selling company assets without adequate consultation with affected family members. Most creatively, it suggested that my actions had been motivated by personal animus rather than legitimate business considerations, and therefore the sale should be considered part of our marital property dispute. I had to admire the legal creativity, even if the logic was completely backwards. Somehow, in Rena's version of events, My response to being fired had become the real crime, while the actual firing was just a minor misunderstanding between family members. But here's what made the whole thing particularly absurd. She was also asking for spousal support. The woman who had just destroyed a multi-million-dollar company through her own incompetence was now claiming that she needed financial assistance to maintain her lifestyle while she rebuilt her career and reputation. I called Mara immediately. "Let me guess," she said when I told her about the papers. "She's claiming the sale was motivated by marital discord rather than business reasons? How did you know?" "Because it's the only legal angle she's got. If she can convince a judge that you sold the company out of spite rather than sound business judgment, she might be able to argue that the proceeds should be considered marital property subject to division. And will that work? Not a chance in hell. We've got 8 years of documentation showing that your ownership stake was earned through legitimate business investments. We've got the voicemail where she fired you. We've got Stratmore's due diligence reports showing that the sale was based on fair market valuation. Most importantly, we've got the timeline. You didn't sell because you were mad about your marriage. You sold because you were terminated from a company you owned." Mara was right, but the process still had to play out. Over the next 2 months, I found myself sitting through depositions where Rena's attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-husband who had destroyed his wife's family legacy out of wounded pride. They brought in character witnesses who testified about how devoted Rena had been to preserving her grandfather's business vision. They presented financial projections showing how much the Valegrow name and reputation had been worth before I sabotaged the company by selling to corporate raiders. The most surreal moment came when Thea took the stand to explain how my sudden and unexpected departure had destabilized the company's operations. According to her testimony, I had been a valued employee whose institutional knowledge would be difficult to replace, but I had never been the driving force behind the company's success. That credit belonged to the family leadership that had guided strategic decisions and maintained client relationships. Listening to her rewrite history in real time was almost impressive. In her version of events, I had been a competent operations manager whose departure had created temporary disruptions, but nothing that couldn't be overcome with proper planning and adequate resources. The fact that Stratmore had found evidence of financial irregularities and questionable business practices was just coincidental bad timing that had nothing to do with family management decisions. The judge wasn't buying it. When Mara presented our evidence, every contract, every financial record, every documented instance of my investment in the company, the case became a masterclass in the difference between legal reality and wishful thinking. The court ruled that not only was the sale of Valegrow and Company completely legitimate, but that Rena's claims of emotional distress were undermined by the fact that she had initiated the termination that led to the sale. As for spousal support, the judge noted that since Rena had been receiving substantial compensation from the company right up until its sale, and since that compensation had been funded by a business I had built and financed, any reduction in her income was the direct result of her own decision to terminate my involvement. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Rena didn't attend. Her attorney said she was pursuing new business opportunities and couldn't be present. I signed the papers, shook hands with the judge, and walked out into the Atlanta sunshine as a officially single man. I didn't keep anything from our shared life except one thing: an email Rena had sent me at 2:47 a.m. during our second year of marriage, when the company had been struggling with a major logistics crisis that threatened to bankrupt us. The email was short. "We couldn't survive this without you. Thank you for everything you do that nobody sees." I kept it as a reminder that she had once understood exactly what my contributions were worth. She had just chosen to forget. After the divorce was finalized, I had to figure out what to do with all the physical remnants of a life I'd spent 8 years building with someone who'd turned out to be a stranger. The house in Buckhead, the one with the perfect kitchen where I'd made my last cup of coffee before everything changed, went to Rena as part of the settlement. I didn't fight it. Material possessions lose their meaning pretty quickly when you realize the person you shared them with never really knew who you were. The moving process was surprisingly simple. Most of what I'd accumulated during our marriage fell into 2 categories: things that had never really mattered to me, and things that had only mattered because I'd thought they mattered to us. The expensive furniture we'd picked out together for rooms we'd barely used. The art collection Rena had insisted would appreciate in value, but that mostly just made our walls look like a hotel lobby. The wedding photos that now seemed like documentation of an elaborate performance rather than genuine moments of happiness. I didn't want any of it. The books came with me, mostly business and strategy titles that had actually been useful over the years. My coffee equipment, because a man needs his rituals. My clothes, which had always been simple and practical anyway. The rest could stay or go. I honestly didn't care which. But there was one thing I made sure to transfer to my laptop before I handed over the shared computer. That email from 2:30 in the morning during our second year of marriage. It had been sent during what we later called the Charleston crisis, a perfect storm of supplier failures, weather delays, and client emergencies that had threatened to destroy 3 major contracts simultaneously. For 72 hours straight, I'd been coordinating backup carriers, negotiating with frustrated customers, and essentially rebuilding our entire Southeast logistics network on the fly, while Rena was at a conference in Miami that she couldn't leave early because of prior commitments to industry partners. I'd solved the crisis, saved the contracts, and somehow managed to turn what should have been a company-ending disaster into a showcase of our operational resilience. When it was over, when the last delayed shipment had been delivered, and the last angry client had been transformed back into a satisfied customer, I'd collapsed at my desk and finally allowed myself to feel the exhaustion that I'd been pushing through for 3 days. That's when Rena's email had arrived. "We couldn't survive this without you. Thank you for everything you do that nobody sees." At the time, those words had meant everything to me. They were acknowledgement, appreciation, and validation all wrapped up in a simple sentence that told me she understood the scope of what I brought to our partnership, both business and personal. It was proof that despite all the public presentations and media interviews where she was the face of Vailgrow and Company, she knew who was really keeping the machinery running. For years afterward, whenever I'd had doubts about my role in the company or my value to the relationship, I'd remember that email. When board meetings happened without me, when strategic decisions got made over dinners I wasn't invited to, when I started feeling like the invisible man in my own life, I'd think about those words and remind myself that she understood, even if she didn't always show it. Now, reading it again in the empty apartment I'd rented in Virginia Highland, those same words felt like evidence in a different kind of case. Not evidence of love or appreciation, but evidence of calculated awareness. She had known exactly what I was worth to the operation. She had understood precisely how dependent their success was on my behind-the-scenes work. She had been fully conscious of the fact that my contributions were invisible to everyone else, but essential to everything they were building, which meant her decision to fire me via voicemail hadn't been made out of ignorance or oversight. It had been made despite complete knowledge of what she was throwing away. That realization should have made me angry, but it didn't. Instead, it made me certain that I'd made the right choice in selling my stake. Certain that I'd been correct to refuse her pleas to fix the situation. Certain that walking away had been the only response that preserved any dignity in a situation where dignity had become a scarce commodity. The email now served a different purpose than it had during our marriage. Instead of reassuring me that I was valued, it reminded me never to trust someone's private words when their public actions told a completely different story. She had known what I was worth. She had simply decided I was disposable anyway. That was a lesson worth keeping. The cabin outside Asheville wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered cedar siding, a simple front porch, and about as far from the Buckhead mansion as you could get without leaving the state entirely. But it had 2 things that mattered more than granite countertops or marble bathrooms: silence and space to think clearly. I'd found the place through a realtor who specialized in what she called executive retreats for burned-out business professionals. Apparently, I wasn't the first guy who decided that success in corporate America wasn't worth the cost of dealing with other people's egos and agendas. The cabin came with 40 acres of woods, a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and neighbors who measured distance in miles rather than feet. For the first month, I did absolutely nothing productive. I read books that had nothing to do with logistics or supply chain management. I learned to identify birds by their calls. I discovered that coffee tastes different when you're drinking it on a porch instead of in traffic. Small pleasures that I'd forgotten existed during 8 years of 14-hour workdays and constant crisis management. But eventually, my phone started ringing again. Not with desperate calls from people whose problems had become my emergencies, but with inquiries from business owners who'd heard through the grapevine that there was a guy in the mountains who understood how to fix broken operations without the drama and politics that usually came with corporate consulting. That's how Vega Solutions was born. Not as a grand business plan or a strategic response to market opportunities, but as a simple service for people who needed clarity instead of complexity. No flashy website. No marketing materials promising revolutionary approaches to business transformation. Just me, a phone number, and a reputation for solving problems that other consultants couldn't or wouldn't touch. My clients aren't the kind of companies that make headlines or win industry awards. They're family-owned manufacturers whose growth has outpaced their systems. Regional distributors whose founders are ready to retire, but whose operations depend too heavily on institutional knowledge that's never been documented. Mid-sized logistics companies whose success has created complexity they don't know how to manage. I help them build the kind of operational foundation that can survive transitions, growth spurts, and the inevitable moments when key people leave for better opportunities. I teach them how to create systems that work even when the person who designed them isn't around to explain how everything fits together. The work is satisfying in ways that managing Vail Grow and Company never was. When I fix a problem for these clients, they understand what I've done and why it matters. When I implement a new system, they're involved in the process and capable of maintaining it after I'm gone. When I present solutions, they ask intelligent questions instead of nodding politely and then ignoring my recommendations. Rena still sends emails occasionally. Updates about her new ventures, invitations to industry events where she's speaking, articles mentioning her work as a resilience consultant, helping businesses recover from operational disruptions. I don't read them anymore. The preview text is usually enough to tell me everything I need to know about how she's chosen to reframe our history. Fia has apparently moved to California to pursue something involving sustainable packaging solutions and social media marketing. According to LinkedIn, she's now a disruptive innovation strategist, working with startups that want to revolutionize traditional business models through conscious capitalism. I don't return their messages because there's nothing left to discuss. They taught me the most valuable lesson of my professional life. When people show you how little they value your contributions, believe them immediately and act accordingly. The silence up here in the mountains is honest. It doesn't promise more than it can deliver, and it doesn't take credit for work it didn't do.